Welcome to the Swedish Tankmuseum, Arsenalen. During the 1950s, the development of tanks had gone quite far, and the old armored cars they had for transporting the infantry to follow the tanks, they were not that suitable for the task anymore. They were not so able to follow the tanks in rough terrain. So they needed to find a solution, a vehicle that could travel together with the tanks, protected, and also had the same speed as the tanks. So this was not really suitable for that task, so they had to invent something new. And the result is this, the Swedish APC 301 PBV 301. They used an old chassis from the Swedish version of the Panzer 38T, which we licensed produced in Sweden during the Second World War as Stridsvagn Model 41. In the late 1950s, they were taken out of service and they decided to use that chassis to build this vehicle. So they kept the chassis with the original gearbox and just welded on a new upper structure with a new engine, and they had created an APC. One of the first really designed APCs with protection for the infantry at the rear and with a 20mm gun on the roof. Not a bad idea, but the result with this quite cramped vehicle was not that very good. But they decided this is something that is good enough, waiting for something better to come later on. So they just made these 220 of them to be something in between, from nothing to something better. In the tank, the engine was at the rear and the gearbox at the front. So in order to create the vehicle that they wanted, they had to take everything out and think how to solve this problem, to create this fighting area at the rear without anything disturbing. So they put an engine at the left front of the vehicle together with the original gearbox. So they could have 8 soldiers at the rear and a crew of 2, the gunner and the driver at the front. In the tanks, they had 2 different chassis, one shorter and one a bit longer, and that was because they had different engines in the tanks. So when they decided to use this one, they used all the 220 tanks, and they also had different length in chassis. So they had 2 versions, and you can spot the difference with the gap between the 2 road wheels in the middle. This is the shorter one with a shorter distance, and there was also a longer one with a longer distance. And you could also tell the difference depending on the registration number. The shorter ones, they had only 3 digits in the registration. With the longer versions, they were 5 digits in the registration, so you could tell the difference. But apart from that, they were all the same. This is the room inside of this APC, with space for 8 soldiers, 1 commander of the squad, and the rest sitting on each side. Behind their back they had machine guns, anti-tank weapons, ammunition, also ammunition store under the seats. Not so much space, but it was better than nothing, and with the doors at the rear they could go outside quite easily and quite fast, so they could dismount this vehicle, go into combat quite quickly. There was also a possibility to open up the roof hatches, manually opened, quite heavy, and 2+2 soldiers could stand up there and fire from the moving vehicle out towards the sides. So that was also something they invented when they did this. Also possibility to carry stretchers with wounded soldiers inside the vehicles in case of emergency. And this whole idea is something that they later took with them into the new armored personnel carrier, the 302, that came a few years later. 8 people at the rear, 1 gunner behind me, and the driver at the far right front. And the gunner for the automatic gun on the roof had his ammunition on the inside and with belt loading up to the gun on the roof. And that was an old 20mm gun they took from an aircraft, turned it upside down and put it up here, and it was quite effective towards ground targets or as anti-aircraft protection. So the idea from the beginning was a quite good vehicle, but cramped and not so reliable. So they decided to take it out of service only after a few years in service. This, that looks like a big washing machine, that's the engine. It's a 4-cylinder air-cooled boxer engine, 5.15 liters and 150 horsepower. It was developed by Svenska Flygmotor, SFA, in Trollhättan, B44. From the beginning it was intended to be used as an aircraft engine, but for several reasons they never used it. So they had this engine ready for use, and they decided it would fit quite easily into this. So from the engine via a big fan belt down to the original transmission, which is a Praga-Wilson pre-selected gearbox. Quite easy to drive. You need a strong left leg for the gear changing pedal, since it's not servo assisted. But apart from that, quite easy to drive the vehicle. If you remove the cover, you don't see very much, apart from the 2 magnetos, the oil filler to the oil tank, and underneath the engine there is the petrol tank. The cruising range for this vehicle was about 300 kilometers. This APC, the 301, introduced in 1960, they were used during a very short period of time. They were taken out of service in 1971. During the 1960s, these 220 vehicles were not enough to fill all the armored battalions. So they had battalions with the APC, and they also had battalions with the armored car Kåpebilen, which was not as effective as this one. But this was a solution to do something better than nothing, waiting for the next version, the 302, to come later on. So it was a good idea, but not that good. But as mentioned before, better than nothing, waiting for something better. If you like our films, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, and you can also check out the Facebook and Instagram. Until next time, bye-bye.